Hi guys, I'm Pastor Colin with Aletheia Bible Fellowship. We're continuing our sermon arc about food today, integrating our biblical worldview fully into something as simple as food. So, join us as we look into our sources of food like animals and plants and how we support the right things that honor God's creation in the way that He intended. We hope it finds you well, and we hope it's useful to you. Thank you. Well, thanks guys for offering those personal pieces of investment and sacrifice for our worship today. That is sort of, in my mind, the topic of the month is bringing everything in praise to God, right? And one of those things that sort of slips under the table, if you will, is our food. So we've been talking about that this month. This particular week, we are delving into some discernment in regard to that in terms of where our food comes from. You know, not necessarily the relational aspects of food and the theological aspect. Well, everything's theology, but we're going into a different area that, quite frankly, it's sort of weird to go into because it's not a common area to go into. But today we're going to talk about how we relate with the food that's on our table. So let's start with a story. There's a story of a man who kept a golden retriever. The animal shelter paid the man enough to earn a small profit from keeping watch over the dog. They didn't take the retriever out to hunt or fetch. They never went on walks. They fed it the same Alpo every day. And it lived in the little 3-foot by 5-foot dog house on a chain just long enough to get outside and poop. He never even bothered to name the dog. The dog lived its whole life like this, never seeing potential adopters. And then the man also acquired another dog, like this one, and then another, taking the burden off of the animal shelter as was needed. The man had neighbors who saw this going on day after day, but they carried on relationships with the man and they didn't say anything. They claimed it wasn't their business, and in fact, the man was generous with them and gave them small gifts from time to time. He seemed like a good, relational neighbor, giving them a little bit of what he had. Do you think these neighbors were righteous? Was God pleased with them? Was God pleased with the dog caretaker? I think the obvious answer to that is, of course not. We would be really sad and really angered if we saw that scenario. We'd like to think that we would say something or do something about that if we were those neighbors. But the question is there much of a difference between this dog and the total neglect of the animals that we eat? We're disconnected from them. We're not disconnected from things like dogs and cats and even horses or whatever, things that are more relatable for us. But, what about a cow or a pig or a chicken? How much different are we from this dog abuser in that scenario? Do we give any thought to the care of the animals which feed us? Why is there a difference in how we feel between those things and the impact that we have? These are questions that we should be discerning of. Is it because that we have a relationship with the household domestic animals? Because they give back to us in certain ways that we understand more intimately? What's more, I would ask you, that an animal serves with its attention and its snuggles or its entire life and sacrifice? Though we're not familiar with them, farm animals have God-given nature, just like dogs. And that nature begs to be expressed and has a real usefulness in God's created systems. And when we see that nature suppressed, right, held underwater to the point where it can't breathe or do anything or be functional, that is a sad story. It's an ugly story. The animal nature of a dog versus a farm animal is no different. in terms of the base nature of it. They are still creatures of God. Their contributions are also different, and they're uniquely valuable. But do they not deserve the same respect as a creature of God? I would purport that they do. So in this, as we approach it, we shouldn't be self-focused, but outward-focused as we go and try to discern these things, discern these topics. If we're self-focused, we think, oh yeah, this is a little fuzzy dog or a kitty or whatever, and this thing has more rights. Because we tend to, as we perceive things to be more similar to us, we tend to ascribe more value to them. But the reality of it is that they are all creatures of God. They all deserve a certain level of respect. So we need to be outward focused, not judging things by our own internal standard, but by God's standard, right? As is the normal requirement for discernment. So as we look at our sources of food, we should also be outward looking, not things that are not appropriately seen through the lens of ourselves. You know, we need to see through the lens of God in order to appropriately see things. Does God want us to do right because we've gained something? Like in that scenario of the dog caretaker or whatever. Because you're getting a little profit from something, does that justify an action or a neglect of God's creation? Yeah, or is it because the animal treats us in a certain way? Does that mean that we should treat it in a certain way? No. Christ's standard, right, is that we treat things on the basis of who they are before God, not based on what they do to us, just like the standard that we are to love our enemies. Obviously, this is a principle of relationship between people, but this is how it is for God. This is how he operates, right? Is that he does things because they're right to do, not because he gains something from that. If he operated like that, we would all be really up a creek. Yes, God has standards and commands regardless of treatment. So I would posit to you that Christians in recent history have trampled God's good creation, even in regard to our basic foods, not as our right as Christians with our appropriate dominion over nature, but as a consequence of our lust and our lack of discernment, which are the topics of the month and the year. So as we look at discernment in regard to food this month, we should take another look at how we do right by the animals and even plants that we consume, and how we make sure that we understand which neighbors we are supporting and have an active mind about that. So in regard to animals, let's go to Genesis 1. Classic passage, verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make human beings in our image, to be like us. They will reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, the livestock, all of the wild animals on the earth, and all the small animals that scurry along the ground." So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Then God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and govern it, reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and all of the animals that scurry along the ground." After God declares us to be made in his image in verse 26, literally 3 words later, he says, "We'll reign over other creation." These are not disconnected concepts by any means. We are to reign like God and how he would do it. Reign, or rule in other translations, is the same word as we find here in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 42, when he says, when Moses articulates, "The people of Israel are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt." Sorry, I sort of presented that weird. Moses wrote the books, but this is like a presentation of God speaking. "The people of Israel are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt, so they must never be sold as slaves. Show your fear of God by not treating," or ruling is the word, "them harshly." So in this, we see that ruling can be gentle. It was specifically articulated and presented in this as not harsh ruling, as a gentle style of ruling. And it's even commanded to be that way, right? Therefore, we are capable of being used as gentle, respectful rulers over creation that God commanded us to do in his likeness. It's not even necessary to infer ruling over creation without regard for its health by these passages of dominion that we find in the beginning of Genesis. In fact, we see the opposite indicator. Moving on to Genesis 2, verse 15, the Lord God placed the man in the Garden of Eden to tend and watch over it. To tend the garden, not to efficiently strip the garden like is the common practice with lots of, agricultural farming situations and animal farming and all these things. But we see that we are supposed to tend the garden, to consciously work creation. And then woman was made as a helpmate. And for what work was that? Well, the work that God gave them. The work that God gave to Adam, which was to tend the garden and to care for it. This is God's intent for his creation and us as masters over it. And going beyond the Genesis passages, in the few passages we have, what does God continue to require? Well, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 8, he says, remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. You have 6 days a week for your ordinary work, but in the seventh day, it's a Sabbath day of rest, dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, any foreigners living among you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything in them, but on the seventh day he rested. And that's why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. So even in that scenario, animals take a Sabbath, right? They're given rest and reward for their work. Because when he's talking about the 6 days of work, that's like most of the work that's being done, right? It's food production. That's what it was. They didn't have an industrial society and all this stuff. There was a little bit of business and things, but it's all agriculture and farming and whatever. So even the animals are required to be given rest and reward because it's a part of God's character. It's who we're supposed to be in his image, even his creation to an extent. And that principle is intrinsically tied to creation. It's God's way for us to respect his creation. It's God's way for him to give them the way that they're supposed to be naturally made to do, not put to work, but for them to be their natural, created, designed animal for a day, to regenerate, if you will. Yeah, it's a direct command, but he also extends that by the character and teaching of God himself. And we see Paul apply that in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy to people. So it's not even just necessarily for that, but it's a general principle which translates through animals, through creation, even to people. And lastly, I want to just present a beautifully simple proverb. It is chapter 12, verse 10. The godly care for their animals, but the wicked are always cruel. It's very simple. And it's intuitive. It says that this should be a part of our character as the godly, as that verse puts it, as that proverb puts it. As God's image bearers in creation, we were intended to act as his representatives. So when God gave us the command to rule over the earth, the expectation was to do it in such a way that reflects his character. Dominion over all living creatures is not a license to abuse them, but a contract from God to care for them. Social contract, we bring it up every now and then. It's the, you scratch your back and I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine scenario. And if you stop scratching my back, then I don't want anything to do with your back. It's the way we often live our lives today. It's even being pushed to live for people to treat their families like that. But we're in relationships in that social contract situation. We're in relationships if they're only mutually beneficial. But did you know that social contract theory was modernly developed in part to protect against forced contracts by abusive government or other people in power? A justified concern. There's been lots of abusive governments. There continues to be lots of abusive governments and abusive people in power. But the reality is that we are born into a contract with God. But he's not an abusive God. He's a good God. and it's a good contract. And we shouldn't allow ourselves as believers to be damaged by the worldview that's put onto us by society, from the trauma that we've caused ourselves over history. But we should fully accept our contract that we are born into with God. And the Bible wastes no time in getting to that contract, as we find it in the very first chapter of the very first book. We as Christians have often chosen to take advantage and interpret free license to be, harsh or oppressive in how we are masters of God's creation. Because after all, it's going to be destroyed one day, right? No big deal. We can treat it however we want. But that's not true, and it's not what we see from Scripture. Everything to God is replaceable. It will all be torn down and remade. So why did he give us any direction? Well, it's because it's important, and it's a witness to his character before the entire watching cosmos. And so we are to uphold that. But it's a sad pattern of all humanity, since almost forever, that we want to build on God's foundation, not to build upon his foundation, but to basically break his foundation down and recreate it, instead of taking what he's laid out in his design and augment it and direct it and tend it and make it beautiful and more functional and all of those things. But we don't tend to do that. But we should. Remember, just at its very basic nature, that the air and the water and the lands and the plants and animals are all declared good. In Genesis chapter 1 also. So we should seek to treat them as such. Transparency in the business world is an interesting thing. Just like with people, when you see somebody trying to hide something, it's probably some shady stuff going on, probably some stuff that they're ashamed of or know they're going to get in trouble for or whatever. It's the same thing in industry. As far as caring for animals properly, the industry doesn't like to be transparent. But transparency is good. In John chapter 3, verse 18, we hear this: "There is no judgment against anyone who believes in him, but anyone who does not believe in him has already been judged for not believing in God's one and only Son. And the judgment is based on this fact: God's light came into the world, but people loved the darkness more than the light, for their actions were evil. All who do evil hate the light and refuse to go near it, for fear their sins will be exposed. But those who do what's right come to the light so others can see what they're doing, and they can see that they're doing what God wants." At the big factory farms and stuff, where they've got a billion animals crammed into like a teeny amount of space and whatever, the tendency is to keep people out, to hide those things. They've even passed laws in a good handful of states that literally make it so that no one can take pictures or have any accountability or whatever in there, and they just have their routine inspections once a year or whatever. And if an employee, it's really weird because even the employee rights are undercut by those things. So they sacrifice all this stuff just to keep things in the darkness, to keep evil deeds hidden or whatever. But we shouldn't be like that. We shouldn't accept that, and we should be seeking to discern what is that and what is not that. So the first thing that I thought about was Foster Farms, chicken. I remember buying Foster Farms chicken when I was batching it. Thankfully, thank you ladies, I don't have to really buy food anymore. But if you go on the Foster Farms website, they have quite a bit of info, and it looks really good. They have a nice little video. It's clearly a propaganda video, essentially, where there's they're in one of their factory farms. There's a handful of chickens in this, it's an indoor building and stuff, but they're taking the food by hand and feeding the chickens. I'm yeah, okay. The Foster Farms chicken that has 4 billion chickens or something stupid like that, 4 million chickens. I don't know what they have, but a ton of chickens. Yeah, okay. They have people going in there sprinkling food by hand. No, that doesn't happen. you know? But it looks good, and they have policies that are good and all of this stuff. And it, you know, like on the surface, what they're telling you looks pretty good, but they're not transparent about it. And you have like these videos that you can look up, and you're like, okay, like how real is this situation? You have to ask all those questions. But the reality of it is that in these big situations, reputation sort of precedes itself, you know? And just like with people, as Christians, we're supposed to be above reproach, like not able to be questioned. And if somebody questions our morality, we're supposed to be able to give account of that and make them essentially look like a fool before the watching world. With these companies, it's not so much like that. There's lots of videos against them over the course of years, like you can track lawsuits and things like that. So it's something to look at and be aware of. There's a big Willamette egg facility in Canby, Oregon, also. They have both cage-free and caged egg hens. You know, they claim that their hens are healthier in cages with like the poop conveyors like going underneath them to like collect the fecal matter so the air isn't like absolutely toxic to breathe or whatever. And they claim that the hens are healthier in there versus the larger buildings where they kind of like roam free and, you know, still a small space, but at least they can like walk around instead of being in a teeny tiny box where they literally the space for a hen for its entire life is the size of this iPad. Pretty crazy. But if those are the two options, is either option really tending to creation there? Is that something that we can honestly look at and be like, yeah, I want to support that. That feels good. That feels like a righteous management, a righteous stewardship of creation. Good discernment on my part. And if that is the case for them, if the cages with the poop conveyors is the healthier option, then I'm not so sure that that says a lot about like that system in general, right? Like you sort of have to question the entire deal. But anyway, does that life in general, those two options, does that honor God's intention for them? No. No, it doesn't. I'm just going to say it authoritatively. Like it doesn't honor God's intention for that animal. That animal is meant to be useful for us. It's meant to be a sacrifice for us in the way that God currently has the world set up, but it doesn't honor the nature of that animal and its value being created under God. But it is encouraging because there's a general direction in the industry in the positive direction. Like Kroger, which I think Fred Meyer's brand, right? And other stores. But Kroger's organic egg brand has subsidized like farm upgrades within the last 5 years or so to give chickens like outside access to like the free air and the like sunlight and stuff. That's good. It's still a far cry from like a legit pasture-raised life, but that's in a good direction, you know? Maybe that's even acceptable. That's not something that's black and white for us. But this is on the back of 2 decades of them making commitments to move in that direction and pushing back those commitments and back and failing on those things. But especially in our neck of the woods here, there's a strong advocacy for that. So it's cool. Those things are moving in a good direction. But regardless, it's moving in that direction. Factory settings still present a real challenge and vulnerability. Abuse slips through the cracks. Like you still find different situations where just by the nature of that, where you have a ton of living things in a very small space, like no matter what you do, sort of like COVID, you know, it's like we can wear 14 masks on our face, you put a whole bunch of people and like some of them have COVID, like it's going to happen. It's going to spread, people are going to get sick, and bad things are going to happen. It's the same thing with animals. To combat that, they have all sorts of unnatural, you know, solutions, but it's ultimately kind of a losing battle in that, and it's a sad battle to fight in the first place. Is that discerning? Is that doing right by God's creation? I would present the conclusion that no, like generally speaking, that is not the doing right by God's creation. But like I said, we're heading in a good direction. Oregon passed a law apparently like a year or two ago that we are, for chickens, like we're supposed to be cage-free by 2024. And with other chicken perks, like they're supposed to have like a a dirt bath and like a scratching post or something like that. That's cool. Keep in mind that just the general state of things, there's millions of chickens, while millions of chickens on the West Coast are going to come into that protection umbrella and get in a little bit more, wing room, an estimated 90% of the chickens in the U.S. will continue to be produced in cages. That's really sad. That's a ton of chickens. If millions are under a safety umbrella, then you have 99 times that, or whatever, that are stuffed in little cages, like 5 of them to a box like this big or something. That's a sad story. At what cost, and where are we going to fall in terms of our own personal responsibility before God? Let's see. Honoring the glory of an animal is a microcosm of honoring the Creator. Like giving glory to the specifics of how God created an animal is like honoring the Creator himself. Just like you go to an art studio, or if your friend draws a cool piece of art or whatever, and you compliment it, and you put it up on your wall or your refrigerator with a cool new magnet that you just got from Beth and I with our new kid on it. Or whatever, like when you honor the creation, you are honoring the Creator. And that's where we want to be moving toward as God's people, and as people that eat food every single day and have a substantial impact on creation. This is also something that watchers can observe as a holistic witness to God, right? Especially if we're having conversations about those things, you're able to explain that thought process of wanting to give glory to God by doing right by his creation and not being selfish and self-centered in your view of these things. We want to elevate God by respecting his creation appropriately, as if it came from somebody significant. Yeah, farming nowadays, it's regardless of how they do it, it's still trying to grow bigger and faster and more profitably, not grown in a way to bring glory to God. And it's not just with chickens. Chickens are a good example, but there's all kinds of stuff. There's, basically all the other livestock. Pigs and beef are the main things. Like Kroger Beef was being sued in late 2020, so just super recently, for falsely advertising foreign beef as U.S. product under U.S. standards and like all that stuff. It's like, so you have all these companies, they're companies. What can we say? Like, it's corporate world. Corporate world sucks. And so they lie about all these things, and they're bringing in stuff, charging the same money as animals that are raised, whatever it is, humanely or organically or both. And we should be aware of those things. Like, we should spend the small amount of effort, right, that it takes to at least look into something like that. All farm animals today are in precarious positions as far as their the respect that they're due as being creations, because the almighty dollar is at stake, and so everything else should be sacrificed according to the world. But thankfully, like I said, we have a different movement going on. As far as plants go, most of us like to eat meat, but the reality of it is that there's pretty much everything else is some sort of plant product or processing of that situation. And you have your genetically modified organism type plants. I don't want to go into all the details of like why this, that, and the other thing, but the principle is that plants, right, are designed to produce after their own kind, according to the account in creation, right? God has a specific design for his creation. It works amazingly and really interestingly, and it's even flexible, as we can sort of like breed species to be different, like how we have all these different types of dogs, they're all the same species, but we've bred them to be specific and functional in all these different ways. Like, God has even made his creation work to the extent that we can work within it and manipulate it and master it, right, in an awesome way. But we have decided to tear down God's foundation, right, and then rebuild it in our own image as much as we can or as much as we see fit to do. We're still not capable of a whole lot, but we're capable of, what as they say, we know enough to do some damage, right? So we make new plants. We stuff and twist their genes together like a glorified Frankenstein situation, right? And oftentimes these plants are made sterile in this process. It's literally like Jurassic Park, you know? It's not as dramatic with things eating you, but it's literally like Jurassic Park, combining unnatural things, taking the DNA of a separate species and stuffing it into another species so that you have a certain trait, or so that it's complete, you know, whether that's resistance to some sort of pests or whatever, or more tolerant to temperature and all these things. We just don't know the first thing of what we're doing, and on principle, it's just difficult because God's created it a certain way, and we are messing with the very foundation of it. And I would posit to you that it's not respectful to do that. And if there was any doubt, we can see it from the fruit of those things and the consequences of that, which I won't go into, but there's a reason why there's different labels that are all over the place, and legitimate government institutions and stuff are saying, like, if you get this certification, you know that it's not genetically modified, you know? It's a substantial and significant jump and different in nature than just breeding plants and animals differently. Nature is designed to be in relationship with each other, right, by God's plan. So an altered piece, it comes with consequences, much like antibiotic use or invasive species are going to have consequences on the land. Like if they use antibiotics, it starts creating bacteria and microorganisms that are crazy, like superorganisms, and resistance to all kinds of things, and they do all sorts of damage. Like any of these major farms, they'll say, we don't use antibiotics, or when we do, we make sure to use ones that are not in the main categories of the antibiotics that people use, because they know that if you're eating the animals that have these antibiotics, then what you're doing is you're passing on that and setting us up for resistant strains of bacteria, right, that are going to be really difficult for people to combat and ultimately be bad for the health of people and whatever. Like, that's the basic gist of it. And it's kind of a scary situation, and they recognize that. We recognize that as a culture. But what do we do with that as our personal responsibility, you know? It is not right for us to look at the government standards and say, if the government says it's good, then it must be good. We're going to get into all kind of trouble with God if we operate like that. And we're supposed to be set apart in significant ways that show who God is. So government standards aren't enough for us. We have to turn our minds on. So are we mindlessly buying food? Are we mindlessly supporting ungodly neighbors who do all these things that have consequences on God's created nature and environment and the agriculture scene, and then therefore even people and relationships and communities, and a big picture that who knows what it is or what it could be? What neighbors are we supporting? There's a corporation called Monsanto I want to pick out. I looked up, like, okay, top 10 most hated, like, corporations or something like that, and why. And here's one of them. Few companies has garnered as much public ire as Monsanto, or for as long. Many take issue with that company's production of genetically modified organism seeds, or GMOs. Over the past century, the company has also been behind some unambiguously harmful chemical products, including DDT, PCBs, and Agent Orange, a herbicide used extensively in Vietnam that's been blamed for 400,000 deaths and 500,000 birth defects. The use of DDT and PCBs was banned in the 70s. Anyway, the point is that many of these companies that don't have the standards to care about this, or they're following the government's, loose standards and aren't being conscious of what they're doing with creation, they bear other fruit that is also of the same nature. And you can see that from like a basic Google search or whatever. I don't know how reasonable it is to research every piece of canned food you have in your cupboard or something like that, but it's something that we need to keep in mind in terms of these things, especially when it comes to big companies and things like that, and to seriously consider how we want to go about living our life. Because these companies that we support by buying their stuff, they follow a secular worldview, and their practices follow a secular worldview. And we can see their immediate and ultimate fruit. So what's our responsibility? What's our godly discernment in that process? Even just the nature of this industrial farming situation, like they're called monocultures, where they just plant like 1 million acres of like one type of thing. It's something that ultimately just breaks down the farming environment and the soil and whatever. It makes things more prone to disease and pests and depletes the soil. And these things they accumulate, like the consequences of that accumulate more and more and more over time. And then you need both of those like issues that I gave as an example, like disease and pests and depleting the soil. They need artificial chemical care to manage those things, and so it just compounds and compounds. What is our responsibility in those situations? At the very least, I would say that we need to be aware of what we're doing and what we're supporting. Psalm 139:14 just very simply says, life is wonderfully made. And so we should look for ways to support the wonderfully made nature of life, and not something that's stripped down and kind of just systematically decimated and then artificially built back up to continue production. That's a sad process. Even if you come to the conclusion that for the time being, this partial process is necessary, because if we took down the 90% of our chicken farms or whatever, like that would have massive repercussions for the country, right? Like we have to manage things, not just sweep and wipe away and destroy. But what are you going to think about? What are you going to reach toward? And where are we at with that? 1 Corinthians 9:23 through 27. Paul says, don't get disqualified from the race. All athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that will fade away, but we do it for an eternal prize. So I run with purpose in every step. I'm not just shadow boxing. I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified. I'm not saying from citing this passage, that we are going to lose our salvation from eating GMOs or sad animals or whatever. But we are to invest with long-term vision, like Paul, storing treasure in heaven and having purpose in every step, as Paul says, not to let our vigilance fall into a lacking state in any place, right? Just like a good watcher, just like a good guard, a vigilant watchman, like we are supposed to patrol the sphere of our lives and make sure that we are consistently reflecting God's character and God's design and his purpose in our lives. This is a big part of our lives, food, but we don't think about it in terms of this very often, but we should. Lust for food, it only has purpose for self. It doesn't care about collateral consequences. Lust in general doesn't care about collateral consequences. So take cheating, for example, like adultery. The family is not considered, the kids aren't considered, people's psyches and health and like all of those things are not considered. It's the moment that's considered. It's getting that intake or input that makes you feel good or whatever it is. In this situation, it's one of our basic needs, food. And a lot of times money is wrapped up in that, conserving our money, and buying the thing that's more attainable and cheaper and readily available. But it has collateral consequences, just like any lust. So whether it's animal abuse or tearing apart God's order and ecology, we need to think about the consequence of what we support or discourage with our money or with our conversations. So we need to understand what we support. Like, just to put it in a stark contrast, if an egg company donated to Planned Parenthood, somebody that is unapologetically secular, they fight for absolute abortion rights indiscriminately, it's something that God must disapprove of, right? It literally came out of anti-God intent like that organization. God disapproves of that. Would you want to buy from that egg company that donated 10% of their proceeds or whatever to Planned Parenthood and stuck it proudly on their label? I would think that most of us probably wouldn't want to do that. Conversely, if you know a certain coffee house that supports Christian youth and is a platform for their outreach ministry, then you'll want to support that and even donate a little extra, be willing to pay a little bit more and give a generous tip for an average drink, right? Because it's about more than that product. It's about what that product represents, what you're supporting, who you're supporting in that. We should not want to only discourage inappropriate dominion, but support the appropriate godly care of creation. Philippians 4:8 says, "Now, dear brothers and sisters, one final thing. Fix your thoughts on what's true and honorable and right, pure and lovely and admirable, and think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise." Set your mind to promote. So we should set our mind to promote and support what's true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. As believers, we should find value in promoting goodness. If you go to a place where they raise animals in a way that respects their nature, that God created them in, that allows them to be the animals they should, to contribute to the farm in all of the ways that they're designed to do by their natural processes of, eating and manure and the different things and the ways that they process their food and whatever, instead of stuffing them all into a box and waiting until it's dead time, But the other scenario, it is honorable and right and pure and admirable. It's like a beautiful situation. We should look to try to put that above efficiency and ease. Be discerning on that. Choosing healthier raised animals and plants. That's not only going to promote good care for them and respecting God through his creation, through his art almost, but also supports community in that situation, which we sort of got into with the coffee house scenario. Farming was the everyday thing for people, back in the day and in biblical times. But even 100 years ago, farming has gone down drastically because it is industrial now. It's not attainable. But small, natural farmers, they have loads of hoops to jump through to sell their product and get licensed, right? And so they have a really hard time. Doesn't matter if their food is tested as safe, only that it checks a million boxes of industrial standards that are utterly unattainable. Oh yeah, you need this piece of equipment that costs $600,000. Of course, this is what it takes to be sanitary. Not really true, is it? But that's government standards. But we can do things in a way that supports that, and we should consider it. Young people, as far as community goes, young people are moving away from farming faster than ever. Are children attracted to unnatural animal care and housing, or a more godly situation that's more akin to, I don't want to over-romanticize it, but essentially like a petting zoo situation? If you've ever been to a small farm, that's kind of what it feels like. What are children attracted to? They have good instincts. Kids have good instincts as far as not yet being trained in the evil ways of man. We should take a hint from them. How is the fruit of those farming ventures seen in legacy, in the large-scale company situation versus the small and more expensive and more organic situation, more intimate, more respectful of creation? Over the last 4 decades, the average farmer age has gone from 50, which is already pretty high, but to 60 now. Those are some old farmers. That sucks to be a farmer if you're, an average age of 60. That's crazy. Where are the kids in that situation? Most farmers, they only sell to one outlet, and not only is that unstable and not awesome in terms of business, but it's also sad. Small farming has more local relationships and reflects God's creation far more beautifully in that. It's naturally attractive to the next generation, and for good reason. So are we scared of being, of walking outside of the status quo for our food and how we get it? We should ask ourselves that and ask if we're actually educated on that situation. It is at a great expense that we sometimes attain industrialized, sterile and pasteurized foods that we know are safe, but at what cost and at what lack of benefit also, if you want to do more research. But as Christians, we should ask, can we trust and support God's design? Why are we buying into all the assumptions and the status quo that we've been presented day after day and have to face in the store each day? Colossians 1:17 says that God existed before anything else and he holds all creation together. Christ existed before anything else and he holds all creation together. Should we imitate God and uphold and conserve all things? Should we look to God for consistent renewal to fuel our relationship with Christ, who upholds and sustains all things? Yeah. So we can work for relationship for each other, and also all things, like creation and our food. So, if you tend to shop in the same place and buy a regular product, quote unquote, it's impersonal, but a food product, an animal product, or whatever, shouldn't you know what you're supporting? And things change. We should stay up to date, like how a lot of us tend to do with the news. It's good to know what's going on in the world. But what if we spent just once a month seeing what's going on the animal scene? Or, once every 6 months. I don't know. It doesn't take a ton to be reasonably educated on these things. I spent a couple hours on it, and it was actually really cool and interesting. I encourage you to do the same thing and do your diligence in being capable of discerning what is godly and what respects his creation, and be convinced of what's the right course of action for you and your family. Until recently, we've had to eat by God's intended design. But if you can count on one thing, you can count on the fact that man will always find new ways of sinning. So watch out for new fields of sin. Food is one of those things. They're coming. The state can't determine ethics and rights and morality, and when they do, we get all kinds of oppressive laws and sketchy stuff going on, as we see on the brink and horizon right now. Whether that's, abortion or discrimination rights and all these things, free speech situations. But it's up to you, before God, to determine what is right, determine what is ethical and moral before God. As adults, we give kids a hard time, right, when they're entitled or ungrateful for their good home-cooked meal. When the kid, you set this nice meal in front of you, you spend all night working on it, and they're like, I don't want nothing to do with that. And you're like, excuse you, right? We give them a hard time when they're entitled or ungrateful for their good home-cooked meal, and they don't appreciate the work that it took to get there. They don't comprehend the money that it took. They don't comprehend the time to get the money or the time to shop for the food, They don't understand the difficulties that you have while earning that money at work, and the problems that you're having with your boss or your relationships or coworkers or work skills that you're trying to like learn a new career or something. They don't understand how hard it is to leave family and friends to go to work every day. But we aren't so different from the naive children a lot of times. How different are you? Are you just as entitled and uneducated about the food that sits on the shelf at the store as your kids are about the food that sits on their plate? Let's contemplate that. And as facilitation for some contemplation, let's ask a few questions for our cell groups. How would you like to show more respect for the role of ruling and tending creation? How would you like to show more respect for the ruling and tending of creation as God intended? What can you do for your responsibility in education and researching? What can you do for your responsibility in education or research? And lastly, how can you support healthier and even godlier community through our everyday food choices? How can you support healthier and even godlier community through our everyday food choices? Okay, let's round up for a little discussion in our cell groups.